Good morning to all the participants. My name is Emmanuel Bלוך, and I am a member of the organizing committee. I would have absolutely loved to meet you all in person today, and I sincerely hope that other occasions will present themselves in the future. The topic I will discuss today represents a continuation of my previous work on Rav Hofman's Tshuvot. In the past, I have analyzed Hofman's relationship to the German state, its institutions, and its representatives. Today, I would like to shed some light on his relationship to Christians and Christianity. My entry point into this topic consists in a very short tshuva from Melamed Leroil, part 2, Siman 148. This tshuva has already drawn the attention of previous scholars. Nevertheless, I would like to suggest that an alternative path can be taken to understand this text in a slightly different way. As the relevant portion of Hofman's tshuva is quite short, it can be quoted in full. Let me try to share the text. I will read the English translation that you can follow on the Hebrew original text on the right. And as for your second question, writes Hofman, whether it is permissible for a Jew to contribute money to the building of a church on account of the principle Mipnei Darkei Shalom, the ways of peace. Behold, I am unable to find a permission which will allow this. For even those authorities who allow non-Jews to practice shituf, idolatry by associating more than one being to God, do not permit a Jew to do so. Therefore, how can a Jew contribute money to the building of such a house of worship where God is associated with another entity? Behold, the Jew would be aiding in the building of a sanctuary, which for the Jew would be a house of idolatry. But if this Jewish person gives money without stipulation to its use, then, and there's the possibility that they will need the money for something else, even though it's also possible that they will use the money for the construction of a house of worship, then it is permitted on the basis of Tosfot Avodah Zarah 13a and the glosses of Rema 149, paragraph 4. Among the scholars who have discussed this text, one finds very prestigious names, and yet, surprisingly, given the modest length of the text, these scholars do not agree on the correct reading. On one side, David Ellenson understood Hofman's ruling as a blanket prohibition. Giving money to help building a church is completely forbidden. As per Ellenson, Hofman desired to protect German Jews from the dangers of syncretism posed by Christianity. In other words, he wanted to maintain a social barrier between the Jews and the non-Jews. On the other side, in his doctoral dissertation, Daniel Gordis understood Hofman as laying down a path based on two isolated sources toward a permissive ruling. As per Gordis, Hofman wanted German Jews to participate broadly in German culture. He wished Jews to be respected and even admired by non-Jews. One brief text and two polarly opposed readings. What's going on here? I would like to present a novel approach to understand this tshuva. In my view, a double contextualization is necessary to better grasp the stakes at play in this short text. First, it is useful to frame Hofman's position in Melamed Leroil against the backdrop of all the tshuvot penned by other poskim who addressed the same question. Second, we can also compare Hofman's psika to his other statements pertaining to Christians and Christianity. This paper will argue that the two perspectives dovetail with David Ellenson's main conclusion. Hofman as essentially prohibiting a Jew from giving money to a church. However, in my view, the evidence suggests that Hofman opted to be strict for a different reason than the factor suggested in Ellenson's article, and I will explain why. Let us begin with the first contextualization, Hofman versus other poskim. The question of giving money to the construction of a church raises a basic dilemma. On the one hand, Christianity is not a completely monotheistic religion religion, according to many Jewish sources. As a result, helping to build a Christian place of worship could very well amount to participating in a project marked by the stamp of Avodah Zarah. On the other hand, there's a pressing social need for a minority religion like Judaism to maintain good neighborly relationship with the majority religion. And this was especially true in 19th century Germany, a few decades after the Jews were emancipated and became full citizens of modern Western nation states. How did other rabbinic authorities position themselves when faced with this difficult conundrum? To the best of my knowledge, there exists in fact 4 other tshuvot, and perhaps 5, on the very same issue. And the accumulated body of evidence paints an unusual picture of Rav Hofman, as I will now explain. First, Marcus Horowitz. Both Ellenson and Gordis discuss this alternative tshuva at length, and note that, despite a personal and religious background similar to Hofman's, Horowitz, who was the rabbi of the general community of Frankfurt, ruled leniently in Matei Levi, Volume 2, Yoreh De'ah Siman 28. For Horowitz, one can rely on the authorities who have advanced that Shituf is not forbidden to non-Jews, Rabbeinu Tam and the Rama. And since associating another entity to God is not an issue for non-Jews, it follows logically that Jews who help Christians build a church do nothing wrong at all. However, it is sometimes overlooked that another German rabbi has ruled on the very same question. Not just any rabbi, Rabbi Yitzhak Una, who was the rabbi of the city of Mannheim, and also, and this is critical, he was a personal student of Hofman when he was a student of the Rabbinical Seminary of Berlin. Una examined the same issue in his volume of Tshuvot Sho'alin v'Dorshin, Volume 1, Siman 35. Significantly, Una departed from the position held by his revered teacher, Hofman, and ruled leniently as well. For Una, just like for Horowitz, a Jew can give money for the construction of a church since Shituf is not an issue for non-Jews. Additionally, Una advances that a building still under construction is not yet dedicated to being a church. Bricks, stones, mortar do not make a church. Therefore, giving money at an early stage of a construction does not raise any halachic red flags. To the best of my knowledge, there's only one late 19th century posek who perhaps shared Rabbi Hofman's reticence, Rav Yehuda Shlomo Tabak, who was the Av based in Sziget in Hungary and a contemporary of Hofman. You can see his Tshurot Shai, Volume 1, Siman 15. But this position is not stated halacha l'ma'aseh. It can be deduced from Tabak's word, it is not stated explicitly. However, the story does not end here, and a dispute between German poskim led to a surprising turn of events a couple of decades later. One academic scholar known to most of us, and someone who has published a lot on Rabbi David Zvi Hofman, Professor Mark Shapiro, raised a fascinating question as a wave of church burning was raging in the south of the USA in the 1990s. Was it permissible for a Jew living in the south of the USA to assist financially in the process of rebuilding the Christian houses of worship? Shapiro turned to 2 prominent poskim, Rav Shalom Messas and Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin. He sent them the 3 tshuvot of Hofman, Horowitz, and Una, and he asked them to arbitrate between the 3 opinions. The response of Rabbi Messas can be found in Shemesh Umagen, Volume 3, Siman 30. For Messas, Horowitz and Una were right, and Hofman was simply wrong. A Jew can give money toward the construction of a church. Rav Henkin's long and fascinating tshuva may be found in Bnei Madim, Volume 3, Siman 36. Henkin took a stricter approach to the definition of Avodah Zarah, and he looked negatively on the possibility for a Jew to help financially, but he nevertheless concluded with some practical advice. Give the money to construct the parking lot. Give the money to build the piping of a building or something else that does not raise an issue of Avodah Zarah. In the end, even for Henking, a Jew can find a way to help his Christian neighbors rebuild their church. In summary, all these four poskim, Horowitz, Una, Messas, and Henking, took a more lenient approach to the possibility of contributing financially to the construction of a new church, a more lenient approach than Hofmann. And at the end of this first contextualization, we realize that Hofmann was and remains to this day more machmir than anyone else who has taken an official stance on this issue. Yet, we are not used to think of Hofmann as a small-minded extremist. This tshuva in Melamed Le'Ro'il 2:148 is a surprising outlier. Let us dig deeper and try to better understand its significance. Second contextualization, what did Hofmann think of Christians and Christianity in general? There's a large number of sources, some of which were published only in recent years. However, given the time constraints of this presentation, I must limit myself to a brief presentation of the most important texts. First, in his responsa, Hofmann stresses that the expression Avodah Zarah should not be translated as paganism, but rather as foreign worship, Fremder Kultus, as opposed to Götterdienst, Volume 1, Siman 20. And yet, in other tshuvot, Hofmann still finds Christians to be idolatrous enough to cancel, bitul, an object or building that is associated with idolatry, Volume 2, Siman 55. As he notes, in this respect, Christians are more pagan than Muslims. Christians are also sufficiently idolatrous for their touch to raise potential issues of Yain Neser, Volume 2, Siman 53. Moreover, Hofmann sometimes used mild derogatory language when discussing Christians' artifacts, mius, gilulim, and of course, we must be very careful not to infer too much from a traditional vocabulary that is used on a regular basis in Jewish legal sources. Still, these elements of language cannot be entirely neutral. They create mental associations and shape the worldview of the persons who employs them. Next item of interest, Hofmanns German book, Der Schulchan Aruch und die Rabbinen über das Verhältnis der Juden zu Andersgläubigen, published in Berlin, 1885. This is an entire book dedicated to the project of showing that the rabbis do not discriminate against non-Jews. In his attempt to prove that Jews and non-Jews are equal in the eyes of Jewish law, Hofmann wrote several chapters that are important to our project today. In particular, the chapters 14 and 15 refute, in the strongest possible terms, any suggestion that Christians could be perceived as idol worshippers in Jewish legal texts. Chapter 7 is also important. It discusses the principle Mipnei Darkei Shalom, which Hofmann represents as laying the foundations for a deep, sincere, and mutual respect between all the members of human society, irrelevant of religions. And yet, it is hard to ignore the discordances that emerge when Hofmann's argument in his apologetic book, Der Shulchan Aruch, are confronted to his own attitudes toward non-Jews in his Hebrew writings. To give an illustration, on page 129 of the German book, Hofmann affirms that the Shulchan Aruch originally never used the expression akum, Ovdei Kochavim Umazalot. For Hofmann, this expression was introduced by Christian censors. Instead, the Hebrew language had two original expressions, one to describe pagans, and the other one to describe non-Jews who are not idol worshippers like the Christians. Yet Hofmann, when writing in Hebrew, uses without any apparent compunction the acronym Akum to refer to Christians. You can see his Melamed Le'Ro'il, Volume 1, Siman 34. The distance between his German writings, destined to be read outside of a Jewish community, and his Hebrew writings meant to be studied inside the Jewish community is striking. Another illustration. On page 91 of the Shulchan Aruch, Hofman presents Avodah Zarah b'shituf as completely acceptable for a Christian. It is completely fine, without the slightest reserve, as a form of divine worship. Hofman writes explicitly that a Jew may have a Christian business associate, and if a Christian partner takes an oath by invoking the Christian divinity, that is entirely unproblematic. Yet again, in his internal writings, Hofman presents a very different picture of shituf. In 1902, Hofman contributed a small article to a journal of Torah studies called Yagdil Torah. It's in Siman 109. In this article, Hofman presents two lists of rabbinic authorities, those who believe that shituf is permissible for non-Jews, and the rabbis who believe that it is prohibited for non-Jews. Hofman mentions several names in both listings, and clearly it was not so obvious to Hofman that Christians had the right to worship the Trinity without violating the prohibition of idol worship. Finally, there is one little-known commentary written by Rav Hofman on the Tefillah Aleinu L'Shabeach. This was originally a lecture in German, and the text was published in Hebrew translation by Hofman's great-grandson in a book called Bayom Ha'u, and most recently republished by Rav Yehoshua Inbal in a book entitled Al HaTfilah in 2017. In this commentary, Hofman discussed the grave sin committed by the Bnei Israel in the desert, Chet Egel Haza'av. According to Hofman, one should not think that the sin of a golden calf was to have replaced God by an idol. No, the real problem was that the Bnei Israel have associated another being, the Egel, to God, Avodah Zarah, b'shituf. Interestingly enough, the Chet Egel Haza'av, one of the worst sins ever committed by the Jewish people, is the theological equivalent of believing in the Christian Trinity. And yes, it remains constant that Avodah Zarah b'shituf is forbidden to Jews, and this last truth does not discuss the legitimacy of such a belief for non-Jews. It remains striking in this text that Rav Hofman condemns Avodah Zarah b'shituf in the strongest possible terms. This concludes our brief survey of Hofman's main declaration about Christians and Christianity. The only positive statements that I have found are located in his German book, the Shulchan Aruch, which is unabashedly apologetic in nature. All other statements, whether in internal German teachings or in Hofman's Hebrew writings, express a noticeable measure of defiance toward the Christian faith, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. To put this point in somewhat simplistic terms, Hofman did not seem to have a deep and abiding appreciation of the Christian faith. Now, armed with these two contextual clarifications, we can now circle back to our starting point, the tshuva from Melamed L'Ho'il, part 2, Siman 148. Who has understood it correctly? In my view, as I said, there is little doubt that David Ellison's reading is correct. For Hofman, there exists a basic prohibition for Jews to give money for the construction of a church. This reading is consistent with a strong language used by Hofman. Ani enini yachol limtzo heter, says Hofman, and with his generally negative stance on Christianity, as we have seen. Incidentally, this is also how Rabbi Messas and Rabbi Henkin understood this text, so I feel in good company. What about Hofman's practical suggestion? Give money without stipulation. As rightly noted by Daniel Gordes, such a piece of advice hardly works in practice. When a Christian community raises funds to build a church, the objective of a campaign is clearly stated. One knows fully well how the funds will end up being used. Giving without stipulation is usually not a realistic option. Moreover, Hofman's proof texts in Avodah Zarah deal with a different context, an annual fair, and these texts do not fully support Hofman's reluctant suggestion. Now, Ellenson diagnosed a conscious policy crafted to protect German Jews from the dangers of syncretism and maintain a social barrier between Jews and non-Jews. Here, I must very respectfully disagree. I would like to suggest that an underlying belief, an unconscious bias, is at play here. Of course, the two explanations, voluntary separation policy as opposed to involuntary anti-Christian bias, are not incompatible nor exclusive. The two explanations can be correct at the same time, the gorem. But if Hofmann wanted to make sure that Jews and non-Jews remain separated, as per Ellinson's suggestion, what is the purpose of the half-hearted suggestion to give without stipulation? Let us consider once again the role dilemma raised by the construction of a church. On the one hand, there are good halakhic grounds for refusing to give money to a Christian church. On the other hand, maintaining good neighborly relations with a Christian majority is vitally important. The simplest explanatory paradigm is to posit that each of the 5 poskim examined earlier, Hofmann, Horowitz, Una, Messas, and Henkin, felt torn between these two basic requirements. Each one articulated his own approach to solve the issue. I submit that the relative weights given to the two factors in the equation is very much a function of each posek's personal outlook. As we have seen, Hofmann is the strictest of them all. His grudging solution is entirely unpractical and leaves almost entirely untouched the prohibition of participating in a project tainted by idolatry. Again, arguably, this position is best explained by the existence of a factor that tilts the balance against Darkei Shalom. In my view, this suggests an unspoken anti-Christian attitude reflected in Hofmann's many writings, and it serves as a significant meta-halakhic factor shaping his psyche. Where does this bias come from? In the absence of sufficient evidence, we can only speculate, but there's, in my view, little doubt as to its existence. As a conclusion, I would like to focus on the bigger picture. Several years ago, I have suggested that Hofmann's Tshuvot present us with a unique window to better understand his personal Weltanschauung. In other words, Hofmann's responsa can be mined with interesting results for insights into his ideas, deeply held convictions, biases, etc., some of which were not explicitly espoused by Hofmann, but rather reflected implicitly in his legal output. In an article published in the journal Modern Judaism in 2016, I have studied how Hofmann related to the institutions of modern Germany. I have concluded that Hofmann's decision-making was, consciously or unconsciously, profoundly influenced by his positive self-identification with a German fatherland, to the point where his jurisprudence departed from all known precedents on two crucial issues presented to him. Today, I have presented the flip side of his research. I have suggested that Hofmann's decision-making was profoundly influenced by his negative vision of Christians and Christianity, to the point where his jurisprudence contains an outlier position that is surprisingly reluctant to carve out a way for Jews to participate in a project that involves financially supporting a Christian faith. If this reading grid is correct, then we can suggest a final insight. Hofmann's Tshuvot illustrate the complexity of living as an observant Jew in the modern era. Hofmann lived in a unique time and place, where the question of the relationships between Jews and non-Jews was articulated in a new and fascinating terms. Hofmann encountered non-Jews in a multitude of capacities, as representatives of the German state, as Christians, but also as business partners, as neighbors, etc. Each kind of interaction potentially led to a different treatment. We have only begun to explore this material. Modern Jewish life is full of conundrums. Living as full citizens of a modern Western nation and as adherents to a minority religion is no simple issue. The lines of tension are clearly visible to those who know where to look in Hofmann's legal writings. we may have an easier time relating to certain of his positions than to others. But one thing is certain, Hofmann did not shy away from the complexity of modern Jewish life. On the contrary, he embraced it. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your remarks and questions.
So I said that I enjoyed all the lectures very much, but I wanted to direct a question to you, Emmanuel. Could you dig a little deeper in that conflict? What do you think about the fact that he could be so apologetic on one side and so on the verge of almost traditionalist, goyim type of discourse in the internal Jewish religious context? How do you see that more broadly in terms of who Hofmann was? Were you presenting Hofmann 1 and Hofmann 2? Or do you think that this is a part of this session is called Hofmann as an Orthodox leader? Where do you see this and contextualize it historically a little bit, because maybe that is one of the key issues here. When he was speaking, what was going on there specifically?
I don't believe it was a Hofmann 1 and a Hofmann 2. Of course, this is speculative, but I guess if you had asked Ron Hofmann how he felt about his German book, I'm sure he would have told you that he wrote in all sincerity, and I don't think he noticed himself the contradictions that we can notice between what he wrote in German and what he wrote in Hebrew. I just think that, again, living in 19th century Germany or 20th century Germany was not a simple reality, that there was some, the old attitudes toward Christianity did not die out easily, and that's certain. I'm not sure. I wanted to claim that he inherited some of these attitudes towards Christianity from his upbringing in Hungary, and I wanted to compare him to Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch relationship to Christianity. I didn't have the time, and I read again what Dr. Ephraim Chamiel wrote on Rav Hirsch. Even Rav Hirsch had different statements about Christians. It is certain were more positive and certain more negative. I don't think it was unusual for a Jewish leader and Jewish thinker to have this kind of nuanced attitude with respect to Christians. I do think it's interesting that his internal ideas and internal are like expressed in his Tshuvot. I think we find a more internal persona, a more internal Hofmann in his Psycha than what we find in his German writings. I think at some level, this is some attention that we all feel. I don't think Hofmann was unusual. I do think he gives a very good opportunity to understand the complexity of living as a frum Jew in the end of the 19th century Germany, or the beginning of the 20th century Germany. I think we have a very good opportunity to get a good glimpse of what the difficulty and the challenge of such a complex